Hey there, I'm Mac the Storyteller, here to guide you tonight. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from, and what time is it? Now, get comfortable, relax, and let the story take you away. The Parker family had always dreamed of a new start, and when they found the old farmhouse at the edge of town, it felt like fate had handed them a second chance. Nestled against the backdrop of dense woods and rolling hills, it was everything they had ever wanted, a place to escape, to breathe, and to put down roots. The house, though worn and weathered by time, had an undeniable charm, its old brick walls telling stories only the wind could understand. Its isolation, once a concern, became a blessing. No neighbors for miles, just quiet, open land stretching out before them. David Parker, the father, stood on the front porch, taking in the sight of the house. The peeling white paint, the overgrown ivy creeping up the sides of the building. It was a fixer-upper, no doubt. But to him, it was perfect. A place to build new memories, away from the stress of the city, the endless noise, the constant rush. This was the fresh start they needed. "Dad, this place is perfect," his son, Mark, exclaimed, running around the yard, kicking at the overgrown grass. His laughter echoed through the empty spaces, blending with the chirping of birds that seemed to have found their home here, too. His excitement was contagious. Sarah, David's wife, stood beside him, gazing at the house with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. She had always dreamed of a place like this, but there was something about the house, something about the way it stood so still, as if waiting for them. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and she shivered. "It's beautiful," she agreed, but her voice carried a hint of hesitation. She'd seen enough horror movies to know that a house like this was never truly empty. Not of history. Not of ghosts. David squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her. "We'll make it work. This is just what we need. A little peace and quiet." The house was as old as it looked, perhaps older. The wood floors creaked underfoot, and the windows were so thick with dust that they almost seemed to have been forgotten. But it was home now. The air smelled faintly of mildew, but the scent of new beginnings lingered, too. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, the family settled in. Mark claimed the upstairs bedroom, and Sarah busied herself with unpacking boxes in the kitchen. David was the last to finish, lingering in the doorway of the house, still taking it all in. There was something about this place, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the house seemed to stand apart from the world. Nightfall came quickly, bringing with it a deep, unnerving stillness. The kind of stillness that swallowed sound. The wind had died down, leaving the house eerily silent. David had gone to bed early, the exhaustion of the move weighing on him, but sleep was a stranger that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside the windows, seemed magnified in the dark. It was then that he heard it. A knock. Soft at first. Then louder. 3 quick raps against the door. David froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited, listening for another sound, but nothing came. No footsteps, no voices, just the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall. "Must be the wind," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He tried to settle back into bed, but something kept him from relaxing. His eyes flicked to the window, where the moonlight cast long shadows across the room. Then he heard it again. A knock. A whisper. "Let me in." David's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to get up, to check the door, but something in the back of his mind held him still. Was it the wind? A trick of his tired mind? The voice, though. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a shadow. It was something else. The knocking continued, echoing in the stillness of the house. David's eyes darted toward the door, where the old brass handle gleamed in the dim light. His body was frozen, unsure of whether to get up or stay where he was. The silence that followed the knock was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. It felt as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. He finally pushed the blankets aside, his feet hitting the cold wood floor. His mind raced as he walked toward the door. Was it someone playing a prank? There were no neighbors for miles. No one would come out here, especially at this time of night. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he reached the door, his hand hovered over the handle. The air around him seemed to thicken, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention. Slowly, he turned the handle and pulled the door open. Nothing. No one stood in the doorway, no figure lurking in the shadows. Just the empty, dark yard. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches creaking as though they were whispering to each other. David stood there, bewildered. He glanced down at the ground, looking for any sign that someone had been there. But there were no footprints in the dirt, no trail of disturbance. Just the same, empty yard. He let out a slow breath and closed the door. "It's nothing," he whispered to himself, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to him. "Just the wind. Or maybe the house settling." But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Something in the house had changed, just a little. And as he lay back down, the silence wrapped around him, heavier than before. But the knocking, the whisper, would return. The knock came again that night. It was softer than before, just a light tap at the door, like someone testing the strength of the wood, but it was unmistakable. David awoke to it, just like the night before, the sound cutting through the stillness of the house. His eyes snapped open, heart already pounding. He lay there for a moment, listening, but there was nothing more. No footsteps, no shuffling, no voices. Only the faint echo of the knock, still ringing in his ears. For a long moment, he stayed frozen in bed, the covers tangled around his legs, his mind racing. It was so quiet, almost too quiet. The silence in the house was thick, unnatural. It felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. David glanced over at Sarah, who was still asleep beside him. Her face was soft and peaceful, her breathing steady. She hadn't heard the knock. She wouldn't. She never did. He wasn't sure why it was always him who woke up to it, why it seemed to reach him in the darkness when the rest of the house was asleep. Maybe it was the stress of the move, the strange atmosphere of the house that was messing with his mind. That's what he tried to tell himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The knock had come again, the whisper along with it, low and soft. "Let me in." David threw the blankets off his legs and swung his feet to the floor. The cold would send a chill up his spine, and he shivered, though he was still sweating from the heat of the bed. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the feeling that something was in the room with him. The air felt different now, heavier. The house was like a vacuum, sucking the sound out of everything, until there was only the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. He slowly walked toward the door, his breath quickening with each step. The house groaned in the silence, timber creaking, the sound of something shifting in the walls. He opened the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, their face hidden in shadow. But there was no one. The porch was empty. The yard was still. No one in sight. Just the dark, heavy night. David let out a long breath and closed the door softly, as though afraid to disturb the quiet. But the unease didn't fade. It lingered, thick in the air, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The next night, it came again. The knock was louder this time, more insistent. 3 quick raps, followed by the whisper, "Let me in." This time, Sarah stirred beside him. She didn't wake, but her brow furrowed slightly, and she mumbled something in her sleep. David watched her for a moment, his mind racing. She had to be hearing it, too. They both did. But when he looked at her, saw how still she was, how unaware, It felt like he was the only one who could hear the truth of the house. He climbed out of bed again, more swiftly this time. His feet hit the floor with a soft thud, and he walked toward the door with determination. As he approached, the air seemed to grow colder, the house colder. A draft wafted through the cracks in the old wood, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch, as if alive. He opened the door, and once again there was no one there. Just the empty yard, the same quiet stretch of land, stretching out into the night. David stood there, staring into the darkness. The knock, the voice, it had to be real. He wasn't imagining it. The feeling of being watched was becoming overwhelming, pressing down on him, filling every corner of the house. It was as though the house was alive, aware of his every move. The air felt thicker now, oppressive. The silence was deafening. David swallowed hard, trying to fight the panic rising in his chest. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the house seemed to shift and groan as if it were waking up, alive with something other than just dust and old wood. He turned and walked back to the bedroom, but it was harder to breathe now, harder to shake off the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. He closed the door behind him quietly, as though not wanting to disturb whatever was lurking beyond it. The next night, things got worse. This time, the knock didn't wake him. It wasn't the sound of a tap at the door, but the sound of footsteps, soft at first, slow, deliberate. It was coming from upstairs. David's heart skipped a beat. He listened, straining in the dark, trying to convince himself that it was just the house settling. But then he heard it again, the slow shuffle of footsteps moving across the floor above him. No one was supposed to be up there. No one was supposed to be walking around at this hour. He froze, listening, his mind racing. Was someone in the house? Was it a burglar? But then why was it so quiet, so deliberate? The footsteps came again, closer now, moving toward the staircase. David didn't move. He couldn't. His body was frozen to the bed, pinned by the weight of the silence that had settled over the house. His eyes flicked to the door, and then back to the darkened hallway, where the shadows seemed to move on their own. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. A pause. A long pause. And then nothing. Not a sound. Just the stillness. David lay in bed, wide-eyed, staring into the dark. The house had been quiet for a few nights, but the unease still clung to the air like a thick fog, unwilling to leave. The knock had stopped for now, but David couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. Something waiting. The silence in the house had become oppressive, a waiting game of sorts, as if the house itself were watching and waiting for them to uncover its secrets. It was during one of these quiet nights that Sarah, pacing restlessly through the living room, suggested they try to find out more about the house, its history, the people who had lived here before them. The thought had crossed David's mind too, but he hadn't acted on it. Maybe they could find something, some answer to the whispers, the knocks, the strange presence that had settled over them. But where would they even start? Sarah pulled a stack of old newspapers from a shelf in the corner, their edges yellowed with age. They had been left behind by the previous owners, and though David had never given them much thought before, he found himself scanning the headlines now. They were mostly small-town stories, local news, trivial events. But there, buried among the mundane, was one headline that caught his eye: "Tragedy strikes at the Hawthorne estate." He pulled the newspaper out, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. The article was old, over 50 years old, by the look of it. He read it aloud, his voice breaking the silence. The Hawthorne family, known for their wealth and prominence in the town, perished in a fire late last night. The house, located on the outskirts of town, was engulfed in flames, with the entire family inside. The cause of the fire is still unknown, though there are rumors of foul play. Local authorities have not yet made any arrests, but sources claim it was an act of arson. David paused, staring at the faded text. His eyes wandered to the photo accompanying the article, an image of the grand old house that now seemed all too familiar. The Hawthorne estate. The very same house they were living in now. "Awesome," Sarah murmured, coming up behind him. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would somehow make the words more real. "You think that's connected to this?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the rest of the article, his fingers trailing over the brittle paper. "They say no one was ever arrested," he said after a pause. "No one ever found out who did it. Did anyone ever try?" Sarah asked, stepping closer to the table, her brow furrowing in confusion. David shook his head, his mind racing. "The town doesn't talk about it. I looked for records, but there's nothing. No one wants to say anything." They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over them. The fire, the loss of an entire family, the mystery that still lingered around it, it felt too real now, too close. The house they thought they had chosen so carefully, the place they had moved into for a fresh start, now felt like a tomb. A tomb for a family that had met an untimely end, and for the people who had been too scared to uncover the truth. Sarah reached for another newspaper, this one even older, its print faded to near invisibility. She squinted at it, then read aloud. "The Hawthorne estate has been abandoned for nearly 20 years after the fire. Locals speak of strange happenings around the property. Lights in the windows at night, eerie sounds drifting from within, and the occasional sighting of shadowy figures in the yard. Many believe the house is cursed." David's stomach turned. He had heard rumors of the house being haunted, but hearing them printed in black and white, confirmed by the townspeople themselves, made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The knocking, the whispering voice, the feeling of being watched, they weren't just his imagination. Something was happening here. Something had happened here. "They thought the house was cursed," David muttered. "That's why they avoided it. That's why no one came near it. Maybe that's why no one talked about the fire. They were all too scared of what had happened. Too scared of the house." "But what about the knocking?" Sarah asked, her voice small and strained. "Why would it come now? Why us?" David looked at the old house, the way it stood in the moonlight, casting long shadows across the yard. The whisper, "Let me in," seemed to echo in his mind, as if it were speaking to him now, as if the house itself was calling out to him, beckoning him to discover the truth. "I don't know," David admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "But I think it has something to do with the fire. Maybe the people who died here are still here. Maybe their spirits haven't moved on." Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you saying? You think the house is haunted?" David didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The look on his wife's face said everything. It wasn't just the house, the family, or the fire. It was something darker. Something that still lingered in the walls, in the air, in the very foundation of the house. Something that wouldn't rest until it was known. The silence returned to the house, heavy and oppressive, but now it was different. It was pregnant with fear, pregnant with the knowledge that whatever had happened here before was far from over. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, distant but distinct. David swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked over at Sarah, then back at the door, as if expecting something to come through it at any moment. The house was alive with the past, alive with the secrets that no one had dared uncover. And now, it seemed, those secrets had come for them. The knocking had returned. At first, it was subtle, a light tap on the door that seemed to come from nowhere, as if the wind itself was playing tricks. But it wasn't the wind. No matter how hard David tried to convince himself of that, the growing dread that crawled under his skin told him otherwise. The knocking came every night now, louder and more persistent than before, as if the house itself was becoming restless, demanding their attention. At times, David would wake in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, the whisper still lingering in his ears, "Let me in." But when he would open the door, there would be nothing. Nothing but the cold, empty porch, bathed in the dim light of the porch lamp. The darkness was closing in on them. But it wasn't just the knocks that were unsettling. It was everything else. The way the house had begun to change, its walls shifting in a way that couldn't be explained. The way the air grew thicker as if it was harder to breathe. The way the shadows seemed to grow longer with each passing day, creeping up the walls and curling around corners. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning up in the kitchen, a plate sitting on the counter suddenly slid across the surface, stopping just short of the edge. Sarah froze, staring at it, her heart skipping a beat. She blinked, and the plate moved again, this time falling to the floor with a loud crash. She gasped, and the sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the empty house. David came rushing into the room, his face pale, his eyes wide with concern. "What happened? Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "The plate. It moved on its own." David glanced at the shattered pieces on the floor, a sinking feeling forming in the pit of his stomach. He bent down to pick up the fragments, his fingers grazing the cold ceramic. But as he did, a chill seemed to wash over him, cold air swirling through the kitchen like a sudden draft. He looked up, his gaze moving to the windows, the door. There was no wind. Maybe it was just a freak accident, he said, though his voice didn't sound as convincing as it should have. Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the spot where the plate had once been, her mind racing. The house wasn't just old and creaky, it was alive, and it was angry. That night, when they went to bed, it felt like something was watching them. David lay still, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He tried to shake the unease that gripped him, tried to find some logic in all of it. But the more he thought, the more impossible it seemed to explain away the events of the past few days. The knocking, the whispers, the way the house seemed to groan under its own weight, as though it were a living, breathing thing. And then there were the shadows. At first, it was just an odd flicker out of the corner of his eye, a fleeting shape that vanished when he turned his head. But now the shadows were more pronounced, moving just out of reach, always there, always waiting. David thought he saw them darting across the room at night, creeping along the walls like they were trying to escape from something, or maybe pull something in. One night, as he lay awake, staring into the darkness, he thought he saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed. Tall, thin, almost skeletal in appearance. Its face was obscured in shadow, but he could feel its eyes on him, cold, unblinking. He blinked, and the figure was gone. David sat up in bed, his chest tight with panic. His breath came out in shallow gasps, his heart thudding in his ears. He glanced around the room, his eyes darting from the corners to the door. The room was empty, but something still felt wrong. "David." Sarah's voice broke through the stillness, and he turned to see her sitting up beside him, her face pale, her hair messy from sleep. "I thought I saw something," David muttered, wiping his hand over his face. "Something," she repeated, her voice low and shaky. "A shadow. Just standing there. Watching me." Sarah's eyes widened, and she hugged the blankets tighter around herself. I don't want to be here any more, David." He could hear the fear in her voice. The raw, trembling fear that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was everything the house had become. A place where reality bent and twisted, where the past and the present collided in a haze of shadows and whispers. The house had turned on them, and now it was pulling them into its darkness. The next morning, they all felt the cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from an open window or a drafty house. It was the kind of cold that sank deep into the bones, as though the house itself had frozen from the inside out. Even the air felt heavy, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. The chill had settled in the corners of the house, in the kitchen, in the hallway, and even in their bedroom, where it clung to the sheets and wrapped around them like a second skin. "I'll fix the heater," David said, but his words felt hollow in the still air. "I don't think it's the heater," Sarah replied quietly, her eyes wide with fear. "I think it's the house. It's alive, David." David didn't answer, but deep down, he knew she was right. The house wasn't just cold, it was hungry, and now it wanted them. It was a night like any other, except it wasn't. David woke to the familiar sound of knocking. Not the soft, tentative tap he'd grown accustomed to, but a sharp, aggressive series of raps on the door, louder, more demanding. His heart thudded in his chest, the beat heavy and erratic as he sat up in bed, the chill of the room creeping up his spine. He glanced at Sarah beside him, her brow furrowed in her sleep, her face pale in the dim light. She never woke up anymore when the knocking started. She was too afraid to. David swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet brushing the cold floor. The room felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in, and he had to force himself to stand, each movement sluggish and reluctant. The knocking was growing louder now, echoing in the quiet house like a drumbeat, a summons he couldn't ignore. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shock through his fingers. He twisted it slowly, not knowing what he would find. But he already knew. He had known for days, maybe even longer, that something was wrong, something he couldn't explain. The door swung open. There was no one there. David stood on the porch, staring out into the darkness. The only sound was the whisper of the wind, the rustling of the trees in the distance. The sky was a heavy blanket of black, no stars to pierce the void. And there, just in front of him, on the worn wooden planks of the porch, were the footprints, mud-caked, fresh, and leading away from the door into the forest. David's breath caught in his throat. He looked back at the house, dark, silent, as if holding its breath, but there was no one to be seen. No movement. The footprints were clear, etched into the wood, trailing off into the shadows. Against his better judgment, David stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the muddy tracks stretching out before him, leading into the woods beyond. He glanced over his shoulder once more. The house was silent. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that he was being watched. But when he turned to look, there was nothing but the darkened outline of the house against the blackness of the night. David took a deep breath and began to follow the tracks. The woods were dense, the trees towering like giants around him, their gnarled branches twisted into unnatural shapes. He pushed forward, the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots the only sound in the stillness. The air was thick, heavy with an unseen presence, the sensation of being hunted creeping over him like a second skin. He felt it then, the eyes on his back, the pressure of something waiting, watching. It wasn't the woods. It wasn't the trees. It was something inside the house. Something that had followed him outside. He walked faster, his pulse quickening, his breath shallow, until he came to a small clearing. The footprints led there, but there was nothing. No figure standing in the moonlight, no sign of whoever or whatever had made them. Just the quiet, suffocating stillness of the night. David stood there for a long moment, listening. The wind had died down, leaving only silence in its wake. He strained his ears for any sound, but all he could hear was the rush of his own heartbeat. Nothing. He felt foolish, standing there, as if he had been chasing shadows. He turned back toward the house, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. But before he could take a step, he felt it, cold fingers at the back of his neck, the hair on his arms standing on end. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." David spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing in the clearing. Nothing but the trees, the empty air, the darkened woods. No footsteps behind him. No figure in sight. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing, and he stood there frozen, caught in the grip of an unseen force. After a long moment, he forced his legs to move, retracing his steps back to the house. The tracks were still there, leading from the door to the woods, but they seemed less distinct now, as though the earth itself was swallowing them up. By the time he reached the porch, the footprints were almost gone, disappearing into the dark. David didn't wait to look back again. He slammed the door behind him, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The silence was unbearable. Inside, Sarah was waiting for him, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. "David, what happened? Who was it?" David didn't have an answer. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't explain the fear that gnawed at his insides, the suffocating sense of being trapped in a place that was no longer a home but something else, something far darker. I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't find anyone. But, Sarah, there was something in the woods. I felt it. It was watching me." Sarah's face went white, her eyes darting to the window. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mark said he saw something." David's blood ran cold. His son? What had Mark seen? He turned toward the hallway, but before he could move, Mark appeared at the end of the corridor, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I saw it, Dad. In the window. There was a person standing there, watching me." David's stomach churned, his heart sinking. He grabbed his son by the shoulders, trying to steady himself, but his grip felt weak, as if the weight of the house was dragging him down. "Where, Mark? Where did you see it?" Mark shook his head. "It was gone when I looked again. But I'm not making it up. I swear." David stared at him, the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. The house wasn't just playing tricks anymore. Something was here, and it wasn't going away. The knocking began again, sharp and insistent, each thud resonating through the walls of the farmhouse. It was no longer a subtle tap, a passing annoyance, or even an eerie mystery. It had become something relentless, a demand, an unholy beckoning that filled the house every night without fail. David lay in bed, his body tense, his eyes wide open in the darkness. Sarah was next to him, her breath shallow, her body rigid. They both knew the sound. They had come to dread it, yet it always came, like clockwork. But tonight it felt different. Louder, somehow. More forceful. The knocking echoed through the house as if someone, no, something, was pounding from the inside, trying to break through. David's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of panic. He squeezed his eyes shut, tried to tell himself it was just the wind, the old house settling, something natural. But the voice had changed. "Let me in," it begged, the whisper now a guttural cry, a scream that sent chills up his spine. He could feel it in his bones, the raw desperation that oozed from the sound, like something trying to claw its way through the walls. The voice wasn't just a plea, it was a demand, a guttural scream from the depths of some forgotten hell. "David," Sarah's voice was barely audible, trembling in the dark. "David, it's getting worse." He didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry, the words stuck somewhere deep inside him, caught in the fear that swelled in his chest like a suffocating tidal wave. The knocking grew louder. "Let me in." The words were more distinct now, the voice rising in pitch, growing frantic. A terrible sense of urgency hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the thing on the other side of the door was suffocating in its need, in its desperation to enter. David pushed himself up on his elbows, his breath shallow and quick. "I have to open it," he said, more to himself than to Sarah. His hand trembled as he reached for the bedside lamp. The dim light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room. The house creaked in the silence, the knocking still pounding in the background, as though the walls themselves were shaking with the force of it. "Don't," Sarah's voice cracked, filled with fear. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight, her nails digging into his skin. "Please, don't open the door. We don't know what's out there." "I have to," David whispered. His voice sounded foreign to him, hollow, as if the sound of his own words had no power, no meaning any more. The knocking wouldn't stop, wouldn't give him peace. It was as if the house itself was calling to him, urging him to open the door, to confront whatever was waiting for him. Sarah's grip tightened. "David, please. I can't take this any more. I'm scared. I'm so scared." The word stung, but David couldn't stop. He couldn't ignore it. Whatever was knocking, whatever was whispering, it was becoming too much. Too real. Too alive. With one last lingering look at Sarah, he swung his legs out of bed and stood. The cold of the floor seemed to seep up through his feet, chilling his bones as he made his way to the door. His pulse was pounding in his ears, the knock echoing with each step, each breath. He reached for the handle, and as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the knock came again. Louder. More insistent. "Let me in." David froze. The scream seemed to tear through him, splitting his thoughts into 1,000 jagged pieces. He pulled his hand back from the door as if it had burned him. The air in the room had changed. It felt heavier, thick with dread. He glanced back at Sarah, but she wasn't there. Her side of the bed was empty. The sheets were tangled and twisted, as if she had gotten up in a hurry. He turned toward the door again, his breath catching in his throat. "Sarah?" His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the pounding chaos outside the door. There was no answer, no movement, only the knocking. The voice was now a roar, a guttural noise that seemed to come from deep within the walls of the house itself. The knocking didn't just come from the door, it came from everywhere. It was in the floors, in the ceiling, in the walls. "Let me in! Let me in!" David stumbled back from the door, his hands pressed to his ears as if that could block out the sound. It felt like his skull was vibrating, like the noise was burrowing deep inside him, scraping at his brain. He could feel the walls closing in. But there was no escape. He turned, his eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, moving and twisting in the corners, pulling at the edges of the light. The house was alive. It was breathing, it was pulsing, and it was hungry. The knocking grew louder, as though the very foundation of the house was groaning under the weight of the sound. The voice, it wasn't pleading anymore. It was screaming, desperate, frantic. "Let me in! Let me in!" David staggered backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind was spinning, a whirlpool of panic and confusion. He tried to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. Nothing logical. No reasoning. No explanation. Only the endless knocking, the pleading voice, the feeling that the house was closing in on him. He had to do something. He had to stop it. He had to make it end. But there was nothing to stop it. The voice rose higher, louder, until it seemed to consume everything, drowning out everything else. The walls, the air, his thoughts, they were all consumed by the sound. David looked toward the door one last time. And then, slowly, he reached for the knob. David's breath was heavy as he descended into the basement, the air musty and thick with the scent of mildew. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, groaning with each step, as if warning him to turn back. But David didn't listen. He couldn't. The house was suffocating him, suffocating them all. And the knocking, the constant, insistent knocking, was driving him to the brink of madness. It had to stop. It had to. The basement door opened with a slow, agonizing screech, as though the house itself were groaning in protest. David stepped into the darkness, the flicker of his flashlight barely illuminating the vast, cold space. The air was heavier here, thick with dust and forgotten memories. The light danced off the walls, revealing old, rusted tools, crates covered in cobwebs, and piles of discarded furniture. But there was something more. Something out of place. Something that felt wrong. David's gaze fell on a small, forgotten door at the far end of the basement, half hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was smaller than the others, the wood darkened with age and wear. It looked sealed off, too sealed off. The door was covered in dust and grime, the faintest hint of a pattern carved into the wood. It was almost as if it had been deliberately hidden, abandoned by time itself. His heart raced in his chest as he approached the door, his footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust. He reached for the handle, his fingers trembling. It was locked, but not just any lock, a padlock, rusted with age, its metal surface worn and corroded. The key was long gone, lost to the years. David's mind raced. What could be behind this door? Why had it been sealed away, left untouched for so long? Without thinking, he grabbed an old crowbar from a nearby shelf. It was heavy, worn from years of use, but it had a certain weight to it that felt comforting in his hands. He wedged it into the crack beneath the padlock and, with a grunt, pried it loose. The lock gave way with a loud snap, the metal scraping against the wood as it fell to the ground. The door creaked open, its hinges protesting, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. David hesitated for just a moment before pushing it wide, the darkness beyond swallowing up the dim light from his flashlight. The room was small and cramped, hidden away from the rest of the house like some forgotten secret. It smelled musty, the air thick with the scent of rot and decay. The floor was covered in dust, but it was the walls that caught David's attention. They were lined with old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. The faces in the photos were blurry, distorted, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase their features. But what caught his breath in his throat wasn't the photos, it was the words. Scrawled across the walls, in fading ink, was the same phrase over and over again. "Let me in." The words were written in uneven, jagged handwriting, some of them barely legible, the ink bleeding and fading with age. They covered the walls like a twisted mural, an obsession that had consumed the very walls of this room. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." David's chest tightened, a cold dread crawling up his spine. His mind screamed for answers, but there was no time. No time to make sense of it. The knocking, the whispering, it was all connected. The words in this room were the same words that had haunted them for days. The voice. The knocking. It was all the same. He stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. On the far wall, tucked away in the corner, was an old wooden chest. It was small, old-fashioned, and seemed almost out of place in this dark, forgotten room. It looked untouched, undisturbed, until now. David knelt down and reached for the chest, his hand shaking as he unlatched the rusted lock. He lifted the lid, the hinges creaking loudly, and looked inside. What he found made his stomach churn. The chest was filled with old journals, books that seemed as ancient as the house itself. He flipped through the first one, his fingers tracing the fragile pages. The writing inside was spidery, barely readable. But there, in the margins, was the phrase again. "Let me in." Over and over, and over again. David's head swam. His thoughts were a whirl of confusion and dread. He could barely comprehend what he was seeing, but there was no mistaking the connection. This house, these people, they were part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Something ancient. Something hungry. The words on the walls, the whispering, the knocking, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a spirit. It was something else. Something that had been trapped in this house for years, waiting, clawing at the walls, desperate to be let in. David slammed the chest shut, his mind racing. His body was shaking, the weight of the room pressing down on him, the air thick with the stench of decay and desperation. He had to get out. He had to leave. But as he turned to go, he saw it. In the corner of the room, standing just beyond the threshold of his flashlight's beam, was a figure, tall, thin, with long, gnarled hands that stretched out toward him. The figure was barely visible in the shadows, but its presence was undeniable. David froze. His blood ran cold as the figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes locking onto his. The whisper came again, softer now, but filled with raw need. "Let me in." The days had stretched into an endless, suffocating fog, each one blending into the next, the weight of the house pressing down harder with every passing moment. David Parker woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was quiet, too quiet, but even in the silence, he could feel it. The presence, the watching eyes. It was always there, just beyond his vision, just out of reach. He rubbed his face with his hands, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare that still clung to him. The shadow, the thing that had been following him in his dreams, its black eyes fixed on him, its voice like a scream that never quite reached his ears. David had been trying to rationalize it all. The knocking, the whispers, the shadows. But there was no way to make sense of it anymore. It wasn't just the house. It was something inside him too. Something that was changing, something that was growing. He stood up, careful not to wake Sarah, who lay beside him, her face pale and pinched with the weight of the same sleepless nights. The house was never dark enough to hide its secrets. There was always something moving in the corners of his vision. Something that wasn't quite right. Mark's voice, shaky and hoarse, called from the hallway. "Dad, come here. You need to see this." David's stomach turned. He didn't want to go, didn't want to see what his son had found now. But he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't ignore the feeling that it was all converging, like a storm on the horizon, pulling them all closer and closer to something they weren't ready to face. He walked down the hall to Mark's room, the floorboards creaking under his feet, the house groaning with age. The house was alive in its own way, alive with dread, with hunger. He found Mark standing by the window, staring out into the yard. "What is it?" David asked, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Mark didn't answer at first, just pointed outside. David stepped closer, his eyes squinting in the dim light. At first, he thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on him, the wind stirring the trees in the yard. But then he saw them. Children. Ghostly children, their pale faces twisted in silent screams. They stood in the yard, their mouths open, their hands reaching toward the house. David's breath caught in his throat. "Dad," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "They want us to help them. They're trapped." David turned to his son, his heart hammering. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as he moved toward the door, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of Sarah's voice calling his name from the other side of the house. His stomach clenched. She was awake, but the tone of her voice, it wasn't her. He grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the door. "Stay with me," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We're leaving." But the house had other plans. The moment they stepped into the hallway, David felt the air grow thick, too thick, like something was pressing in from all sides. He heard Sarah again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream. "David!" They rushed toward her room, but as they neared the door, the hallway seemed to stretch, like the distance was getting longer, the walls closing in around them. They couldn't move fast enough. It was as if the house had decided they were not allowed to leave. The walls felt alive now. The house was breathing with them. The creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet was deafening, and every corner of the house seemed to be watching, waiting. Something was drawing them in. Something was making them stay. David reached the door to Sarah's room, his hand trembling as he twisted the handle. But when he opened the door, she wasn't there. Instead, the room was empty, empty except for the mirror. The reflection that stared back at him wasn't his own. It was a version of him, eyes wide and staring, his face pale and drawn. His reflection grinned, but it wasn't him. It was something else. Something inhuman. Something wrong. David stumbled back, his heart racing, his breath coming in short gasps. "Sarah," he called, his voice rising in panic. The mirror began to distort. The image in it twisted and stretched, like something was trying to crawl out from behind the glass. David turned around, frantic, looking for his wife, but the room was empty. And then he heard it again. The whisper. "Let me in." He spun toward the door, his pulse racing. The voice wasn't just in the room, it was inside his head. Mark stood behind him, trembling. "Dad." "What is happening?" David's mouth was dry. His vision was blurring. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Now." But when he turned to the hallway, he saw it. The door to the basement, the door he'd sealed shut days ago, was open. A dark figure stood in the doorway, its face hidden in shadow. It wasn't moving, but David could feel its gaze on him. Cold, unblinking. It had been watching them. "David," Mark whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "What is that?" David's breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't answer. He couldn't speak. Because deep down he knew. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the knocking, the whispers, or the shadows. It was them. The family. The ones who had come before them. The ones who had been trapped in this house for years. And now they were all part of the same nightmare. David had never believed in ghosts. Not really. He had heard the stories, sure, about people who swore they saw things, heard things, felt things they couldn't explain. But he was a practical man. A logical man. Or at least, that's what he used to tell himself. Now, standing in the middle of the decaying farmhouse, surrounded by the echoes of footsteps that weren't his own, he wasn't so sure anymore. It wasn't just the knocking anymore. It wasn't just the whispers that came every night. It wasn't the shadows or the figures that moved just out of sight. It was the house. The house had become something else entirely, something alive with hunger, with a thirst that couldn't be quenched by anything less than blood. David had tried to ignore it. He had tried to chalk it all up to stress, to a tired mind worn thin by the weight of moving his family out here, far from everything they had ever known. He had told himself it was just the house settling, just the wind, just his imagination. But as he dug deeper into the past, as he uncovered the history of the land, of the family who had died here, burned alive in the fire that had consumed the house all those years ago, he realized how wrong he had been. The house was cursed, and the curse was far older than he could have ever imagined. David's hands shook as he turned the brittle pages of the old journal he had found hidden in the basement. The ink was faded, smudged in places where it had been stained with something dark and sinister. But there was no mistaking the words. "Let me in." It had started as a whisper, a plea, a desperate cry. But now it was more than that. It was a demand. And it was growing louder, more insistent. The knocking, the whispers, it was all connected. It was the spirits of the family, the ones who had died in the fire, their souls forever trapped in the house. But there was more. Something far darker than David had first realized. The house had been built on an ancient burial ground. The land itself had soaked up the blood of those who had died here long before the fire. The spirits who were bound to it were not just the souls of the family who had burned, but of those wronged, forgotten, and left behind by time. They had waited for years, centuries, for someone to hear their cries. And now they had found the Parkers. David ran his hand over the journal's pages, his mind racing with the implications. There was no way out. There was no escape. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, one that fed on the living, trapping anyone who came near. The knocking had been their plea. The whisper had been their cry for help. But the price was too high. The journal's last entry, scrawled hastily at the end of the page, sent a chill down David's spine. One must stay behind, locked in the house, to give them peace. The words made his stomach turn. It was a choice. A terrible, impossible choice. Someone had to stay. Someone had to remain trapped in the house, bound to its walls forever, to give the restless spirits the peace they sought. But who? Who could make that sacrifice? David stood there, frozen in the dim light of the basement, the weight of the decision crushing down on him. He could feel the house watching him, waiting. He could feel it in the walls, in the floorboards beneath his feet. It was alive. It was listening. Upstairs, Mark called out to him. "Dad, what's going on?" David didn't answer at first. He couldn't. He couldn't find the words to explain what he had learned. How could he tell his son that one of them, one of their family, had to die to end the torment? How could he look Sarah in the eye and tell her that she had to be the one to stay behind? He couldn't do it. But as he made his way back up to the living room, he knew there was no other choice. The house had made sure of that. It had taken everything from them. It had twisted their perception of reality, turned their nightmares into their waking life, and now it wanted one more thing. It wanted a soul. The knocking began again, louder this time, more frantic. The voice, no longer a whisper, was almost a scream. "Let me in." David felt his blood run cold. His family was in the other room. They didn't know what he had learned, not yet. They didn't understand the full scope of what they were up against. But they would. They had to. He reached the door to the living room, but before he could open it, he heard Mark's voice again, this time sounding more distant. "Dad, where are you?" David's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the pressure of time closing in on him. The house was getting ready to claim them all. He opened the door. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Mark stood behind her, his eyes darting nervously between his father and the empty space around them. "David," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" David opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at her, at Mark, and then at the door, which was still vibrating from the knocking. "Let me in." It was a warning, and it was a plea. David knew what he had to do, but he didn't know if he could live with it. David stood before the door, his hand resting on the cold, brass handle. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was far worse. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, that made it hard to breathe. It was a stillness that threatened to swallow everything, to drown you in the nothingness between what was and what would come. He had known this moment would come. He had known that one of them had to stay. He had felt it in the house's every creak, every whispered word. The knocking had been the first sign, a warning that had become a plea. It had started soft, barely noticeable, like a tap on the window of your mind, but now it had grown into a maddening rhythm, a countdown to something terrible. The house was hungry. David glanced back over his shoulder, where Sarah and Mark stood, their faces pale, their eyes filled with the same dread that had plagued him for days. The weight of the decision hung over them all like a black cloud. The house wanted something, something that would end the torment, something that would allow the souls of the dead to rest. David's grip tightened on the doorknob. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping even more as the house exhaled, as if it, too, were waiting for him to make the inevitable choice. He could feel the pull, the pressure to open the door, to do whatever it took to end it all, to save his family. But as he looked at the door, he knew that the sacrifice wasn't as simple as he had hoped. It wasn't just about saving them. It was about what would come after. The knocking started again, louder now. It was no longer a mere tap. It was the sound of something desperate, something that had been waiting for this moment. It was the sound of something alive. "David," Sarah's voice was weak, barely a whisper. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her hands trembled at her sides. "What are you going to do?" He didn't answer at first. He couldn't. There were no words left. Not for her. Not for Mark. There was only the door. Only the promise of whatever lay on the other side. David turned to face them, his voice cracking. "I'm doing this for you. Both of you." Mark stepped forward, his young face twisted in confusion. "Dad, what do you mean? You can't just leave us here. Please." The knocking came again, this time frantic, the voice on the other side screaming, "Let me in!" The force behind it rattled the door, and David's heart raced in his chest. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a demand. A plea from the other side, but the question remained, what would happen if he let it in? With a final breath, David turned back to the door, his heart pounding in his throat. He reached for the handle again, the coldness seeping into his skin as if the door itself were alive, waiting for him to make the ultimate choice. He opened it. What he saw on the other side wasn't the spirits of the family who had burned in the fire. It wasn't the tortured souls he had imagined. No, what stood before him was something darker, something that made the very air in the room seem to shudder. It was a doorway, but not just any doorway. It was a portal, a rift in time and space, a tear between worlds. The darkness on the other side was endless, a void that stretched farther than the eye could see. There were shapes within it, shifting, moving, writhing. Souls. Souls of those trapped in the fire, trapped in the land that had once been theirs. They reached out, their hands grasping for him, their faces blurred, distorted by agony. The house was feeding on him now. It was pulling him in, whispering to him, calling his name. And as he looked into that dark void, into the eternal prison that awaited him, he understood. The house had always known. It had always been watching, waiting. And now it was time for him to join them. David stepped forward. The air around him seemed to thicken, suffocating him as the door creaked open wider. He heard Sarah and Mark behind him, their cries of desperation growing distant, lost in the oppressive silence of the house. But he couldn't turn back now. He couldn't undo what had already been set in motion. The knocking would stop. The whispers would fade. But it wouldn't end. Not for him. And not for them. He stepped into the darkness. As soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the house. The knocking stopped. The house grew still. But David knew, deep down, that the knocking never truly stopped. It had only shifted, and now it was waiting for the next family, the next victim, the next soul to open the door. The house was silent again.